Look at this door. No, really look at it. 24 meters high, carved from solid stone blocks weighing over 800 tons each, standing in Baalbek, Lebanon for over 2,000 years. Now ask yourself a simple question. Who built a door they physically couldn't reach the handle of? This isn't one door, it's hundreds, scattered across every continent. Egypt, Peru, India, Turkey, Cambodia, all with the same impossible proportions, all built by civilizations that supposedly never contacted each other. And here's what keeps me awake at night. In 1923, a British archaeologist named Edmund Hardwicke spent 6 months measuring these doors across the Mediterranean. He filled 3 notebooks with calculations, photographs, architectural drawings. On November 14th, he returned to his hotel in Beirut, wrote a single sentence in his journal, and died that same night. Heart failure, the report said. He was 32 years old. That sentence? They knew we would come and left a warning in the dimensions. His notebooks? Never found. The photographs? Disappeared from the British Museum archives in 1957. The official explanation is misplacement during a cataloging error. But here's what they couldn't make disappear: the doors themselves. And once you start measuring them, once you actually do the mathematics, something becomes very clear. These doors were never meant for us. Let me take you back to that November night in 1923. Edmund Hardwicke wasn't some amateur treasure hunter. Cambridge-educated, published in the Royal Archaeological Journal, funded by the British Museum, he'd spent 6 months traveling from Baalbek to Karnak to the ancient temples of Sardis in Turkey, doing something nobody had systematically done before, measuring the monumental doorways of the ancient world with precision instruments. His methodology was meticulous. He didn't just measure height and width, he calculated the force required to move the doors based on their estimated weight. He measured the placement of pivot points, the angle of jambs, the height of any visible locking mechanisms. He was, by all accounts, trying to understand the engineering. The last site he visited was the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek. The trilithone stones there, those foundation blocks, each weigh somewhere between 800 and 1,000 tons. Nobody knows exactly because we've never successfully weighed them. Modern cranes can't lift them. The doors built into structures using these stones are proportionally massive. He spent 4 days there. Local workers who assisted him later told British officials that on the final day, he became agitated. He kept climbing ladders to measure the same points over and over. He filled page after page with calculations. One worker recalled him saying in broken Arabic, "The mathematics is wrong. We're too small." What did that mean? He returned to his hotel in Beirut that evening. The hotel registry shows he checked in at 6:47 p.m. He ordered dinner in his room. The order slip still exists in Lebanese National Archives. At some point between 8 p.m. and midnight, he wrote that final entry in his journal. The chambermaid found him the next morning. The medical examiner's report, which I found in the archives of the American University of Beirut, lists cause of death as acute cardiac arrest. Unremarkable, except for one detail buried in the notes. Patient's eyes showed signs of extreme stress response, pupils fully dilated. Expression suggests acute fear reaction preceding death. The British Museum sent a representative to collect his effects. The 3 notebooks documenting his measurements, his photographic plates, his calculations, all packed into a sealed trunk and shipped to London. The trunk arrived. The inventory was logged. Then, nothing. In 1957, a researcher named Margaret Chen requested access to the Hardwicke materials for her dissertation on ancient Mediterranean architecture. The museum acknowledged the collection existed in their 1924 acquisition records, but when they searched for it, gone. The official explanation in the correspondence file, I found these letters, is misplaced during archive reorganization in 1946. Curious timing, just after World War II when many institutions were relocating materials. But here's the detail that still bothers me. In 1961, an antiquarian book dealer in Cairo tried to sell a notebook he claimed came from Hardwicke's collection. The British Museum sent someone to authenticate it. The dealer died in a car accident 3 days before the meeting. The notebook disappeared. Now, I'm not suggesting conspiracy. People die, records get lost, these things happen. But they keep happening around these doors. In 1978, a structural engineer named Yuri Kasparov published a paper in an obscure Soviet engineering journal about the mechanical impossibility of certain ancient doorways. He calculated that the doors at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, based on their estimated weight and the leverage points visible in the stone, would require approximately 15,000 kilograms of force. For reference, that's roughly the pushing force of a fully grown African elephant. His paper was published in March. By July, he'd retracted it, stating computational errors. He never published on ancient architecture again. I found his paper, by the way. There are no computational errors. His mathematics is sound. So what did Edmund Hardwick discover that November night? What did he mean by, "they knew we would come"?
The only clue we have is the measurement data other researchers collected independently. And when you look at those numbers, when you really examine what these doors are, the question isn't who built them. The question is, who were they built for? Because one thing becomes mathematically certain: not humans. At least, not humans of our proportions. But before we go further into the mathematics, I need you to understand something. What you're about to see isn't speculation. These are measurements, verified, cross-checked, impossible to dispute. And if you're wondering where this goes, if you're starting to feel that itch of "I need to know more," then you should probably subscribe, because what we're going to explore in the next video will make these doors look simple. We're going to talk about the staircases, the ones built inside these temples, the ones where each step is 70 centimeters high. You can't climb those stairs. Physically, biomechanically, you cannot climb a 70-centimeter stair without using your hands. So who walked up them? But first, we need to understand the doors, because the doors are the entry point to a much bigger question. Here's what stops most people from taking this seriously: the assumption that ancient builders were primitive, that they didn't understand mathematics, engineering, proportion. That assumption dies the moment you actually measure these structures. Let me show you something that changed how I think about this. In 2006, a team from MIT did a laser scanning at Karnak Temple in Egypt. They weren't looking for anything mysterious, just creating a digital archive. But when they processed the data, they found something unexpected. The doors throughout Karnak, all of them, across different dynasties, different pharaohs, different centuries of construction, maintain a precise ratio of 7:1. Height to width, 7:1. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly 7:1, within millimeters. Why does that matter? Because that's not a human proportion. When we build doors, we use different ratios based on function. Standard doors are about 2:1. Grand ceremonial doors might be 3 or 4:1. 7:1 is unusual. It's a proportion that suggests something very specific about the size of whoever would use them. And that proportion appears everywhere. Let's talk about scale. A standard door in a modern building is about 2 meters high, maybe 2.1 if it's ceremonial. This works for humans who average between 1.6 and 1.8 meters tall. The door is roughly 1.2 times the height of the average user. It makes clearance for the head, for carrying objects, for comfort. It's proportional. It makes sense. Now, let's look at the Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek. The main entrance doorway, the one that remains partially standing, is approximately 24 meters high. 24 meters. That's an 8-story building. If we apply the same proportional logic that we use for human doors, that a door should be about 1.2 times the height of its user, we get something disturbing. 24 divided by 1.2 equals 20 meters. The door is proportioned for something 20 meters tall. Now, I can already hear the objection. It's ceremonial. It's meant to inspire awe. It's symbolic. Fair point. Except for one problem: the mechanics. In 2009, a team of structural engineers from the University of California, Berkeley, partnered with the Lebanese Department of Antiquities to study the Baalbek stones. They weren't trying to prove anything mysterious. They were analyzing ancient engineering techniques for a textbook. They discovered that the doors, based on the surviving pivot point indentations and the wear patterns on the stone thresholds, were functional. They actually opened and closed. These weren't symbolic facades. They were working doors. The Berkeley team calculated that the main doors, if constructed as the evidence suggests, would have weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 tons. Each door, not both, each. To put that in perspective, a fully loaded semi-truck weighs about 36 tons. The engineer who led the study, a professor named David Chen, published his findings in the Journal of Archaeological Engineering. His conclusion, stated very carefully, was that the doors present significant challenges to our understanding of ancient mechanical advantage systems. What he meant, what he couldn't quite say in an academic journal, was simpler. We don't know how they opened these doors. Not just we don't know the exact technique, we don't know how it was physically possible. The force required to move a 60-ton door, even with the most efficient pivot system we can design, exceeds what humans can generate through any known ancient mechanical system. Pulleys, levers, counterweights, the math doesn't work. You'd need either dozens of people operating a complex machine, no evidence of such machines exists, or users strong enough to simply push them open. But let's set aside strength for a moment. Let's talk about reach. I'm 183 centimeters tall, slightly above average for a modern human. If I stand in front of a standard door, I can comfortably reach the handle, which is usually positioned about 1 meter off the ground. That's roughly 55% of my height. If we maintain that same proportion, 55%, for a 24-meter door, the handle would be positioned at 13.2 meters off the ground. 13.2 meters. That's the height of a 4-story building. And here's the thing. We've found the handle mechanisms, or rather the slots where they were mounted. At Karnak Temple in Egypt, at the Temple of Horus in Edfu, at several sites in Upper Egypt, there are rectangular slots carved into the door jambs at heights ranging from 10 to 15 meters off the ground. These slots show wear patterns. They held something that moved. Egyptologists generally describe these as mounting points for ceremonial decorations. But Dr. Salima Hassan, who spent 30 years working at Karnak and published extensively on temple architecture, had a different observation. In a 1988 paper that's rarely cited, she noted that the wear patterns on these mounting points are consistent with rotational stress, the kind of stress you'd see from a lever or handle being operated repeatedly over time. She didn't speculate about what that meant. She just noted it. A lever or handle, 15 meters off the ground. Who was operating it? Now, let's expand the view. Because Baalbek and Karnak aren't isolated cases. When you start looking, when you start measuring, you find these proportions everywhere. The Sun Gate at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, doorway approximately 13 meters high with a 7-to-1 height-to-width ratio. The entrance to the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Egypt, 19 meters high, 7-to-1 ratio. The gateway at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, 12 meters high, 7-to-1. The Lion Gate at Hattusa, Turkey, approximately 16 meters at its peak, 7-to-1. These civilizations, Egyptian, Khmer, Hittite, pre-Incan, had no contact with each other according to conventional archaeology. Different continents, different time periods spanning over 2,000 years, different languages, different religions, different building materials, but the same proportion, exactly the same. In 2014, a mathematician named Robert Schoch, yes, the same Schoch known for his controversial dating of the Sphinx, published a statistical analysis of over 200 ancient monumental doorways across 6 continents. He wasn't trying to prove they were built by giants or aliens. He was simply analyzing the proportional mathematics. His finding, the ratio clusters around 7-to-1 with a standard deviation so small it's statistically improbable to be coincidental. In his words, the consistency suggests either direct cultural transmission or adherence to a shared template. But there's no evidence of cultural transmission, none. No trade routes, no similar artifacts, no linguistic connections. So what's the alternative? A shared template? Where did it come from? Here's where it gets stranger. The doors aren't just proportionally similar, they're oriented similarly. Over 60% of these monumental doorways face within 15 degrees of true east, not magnetic east, true east, compensating for the Earth's axial tilt.
That requires astronomical knowledge, sophisticated astronomical knowledge. And they all do it. Egypt, Cambodia, Peru, Turkey. Why? The standard explanation is solar alignment. Ancient cultures worshipped the sun, so they oriented temples eastward. But here's the problem with that explanation. Plenty of ancient temples face other directions. Plenty of structures are astronomically aligned to the solstices, to specific constellations, to lunar events. But these specific doors, the massive ones, the ones with the 7-to-1 proportion, they face east. Not the temples themselves necessarily, the doors. As if they were built not to welcome the sun, but to welcome something coming from the east, or to mark an exit point for something leaving toward the east. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure anyone does. But the proportions and the orientations are just the beginning, because when you map these doors geographically, when you actually plot them on a world map, you see a pattern, and that pattern doesn't make any historical sense at all. I want you to imagine you're looking at a world map, not a modern political map, but a geographical one, just continents and oceans. Now I'm going to mark some points for you. Baalbek, Lebanon, 34.0 degrees north, 36.2 degrees east. Karnak, Egypt, 25.7 degrees north, 32.7 degrees east. Tiwanaku, Bolivia, 16.6 degrees south, 68.7 degrees west. Angkor Wat, Cambodia, 13.4 degrees north, 103.9 degrees east. Hattusa, Turkey, 40 degrees north, 34.6 degrees east. The Temple of Horus, Edfu, Egypt, 25.9 degrees north, 32.9 degrees east. Just random ancient sites, right? Different cultures, different time periods, different parts of the world. Except they're not random. In 2007, a surveyor named Christopher Dunn, an aerospace engineer who'd worked on precision machining for jet engines, published a book that was mostly dismissed by mainstream archaeology. But buried in it was something interesting, a geodetic analysis of ancient sites. Geodesy is the science of measuring the Earth's shape and gravitational field. It's what surveyors use, what GPS satellites depend on. It requires sophisticated mathematics. Dunn's observation was simple. Many of these ancient sites with monumental doorways align to specific geodetic patterns. They're not random points. They fall on lines of latitude that represent precise fractions of the Earth's circumference. Now, ancient cultures understanding latitude isn't impossible. The Greeks calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, but that was around 200 BCE. These structures are older, much older. Baalbek's foundations date to at least the 1st century BCE, possibly earlier. Tiwanaku's main structures are dated to around 500 CE, but the site shows signs of much older occupation. Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century CE, but it sits on foundations that may be far older. And yet they all align to geodetic points that suggest knowledge of the Earth's exact dimensions. But here's what really stopped me cold. It's not just latitude. If you calculate the great circle distances between these sites, the shortest distance across the Earth's surface, you start finding ratios. The distance from Baalbek to Angkor Wat is approximately 7,200 kilometers. The distance from Karnak to Tiwanaku is approximately 12,600 kilometers. 12,600 divided by 7,200 equals 1.75, 7-to-4, the same proportion that appears in the doors. Now, I know what you're thinking. Numbers can be manipulated to show patterns. You can find mathematical relationships between almost anything if you try hard enough. Fair criticism. Except this pattern was identified independently by 3 different researchers working decades apart, using different measurement methods. Dunn in 2007, a Brazilian architect named Paulo Neves in 1994, and, most surprisingly, a Soviet cartographer named Dmitry Volkov in 1962. Volkov's work is particularly interesting because he wasn't studying ancient mysteries. He was working for the Soviet military, mapping geodetic points for missile targeting calculations. He noticed the pattern and mentioned it in an internal report. That report was declassified in 2003. It's available in the Russian State Military Archive. Intentional site selection based on positional calculations by cultures that supposedly didn't have maps of the world. Let's stay with the geography for a moment, because there's another pattern, one that's even harder to explain. These sites cluster around the 30th parallel, both north and south. 30 degrees north latitude runs through Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, the Indus Valley, Tibet, and Japan. 30 degrees south runs through South Africa, Australia, and southern South America. More than 70% of the massive ancient doorways, the ones with that 7-to-1 proportion, fall within 5 degrees of one of these two parallels. Why? The 30th parallel has no particular geographical significance. It's not the Tropic of Cancer or Capricorn, it's not the equator, it's just a line, an arbitrary division of the Earth's surface. Unless it's not arbitrary. In 1998, a geophysicist named Dr. Jennifer Wu published a paper in the Journal of Geomagnetic Research about ancient awareness of the Earth's magnetic field. She wasn't studying archaeology, she was studying historical records of magnetic declination. But she made an observation. The 30th parallels, north and south, represent zones of relatively stable geomagnetic activity. The Earth's magnetic field fluctuates, but it's more stable at these latitudes. Why would ancient builders care about geomagnetic stability? We don't know, but they seemed to. Now, let's address the obvious question. If these sites are connected, if they represent some kind of intentional global pattern, how did that happen? How did cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years of history build to the same template? There are basically three possibilities. One, they didn't. The pattern is coincidental and we're seeing order where there's only chaos. Two, there was contact between these cultures, sophisticated maritime civilizations we don't know about, lost history. Three, they inherited the blueprint from something older, something that existed before these individual cultures emerged. Mainstream archaeology generally favors option one, independent development, similar solutions to similar problems. But that explanation struggles with the specificity. Yes, different cultures build monumental architecture, but the same proportion, the same orientation, the same geodetic relationships. Option 2, lost maritime civilizations, has some evidence. We know the Phoenicians sailed farther than we once thought. We know the Polynesians crossed the Pacific. For Heyerdahl proved it was possible to cross oceans in ancient vessels. But there's no archaeological evidence of a global maritime culture advanced enough to share architectural blueprints across continents, which leaves option 3. And that's where we need to talk about what these doors actually depict, because many of them aren't blank stone. They're covered in carvings, reliefs, images that most museums don't publicize. Because when you look at what's carved into these doorways, when you actually examine the iconography that surrounds them, you see figures, human-like figures, but they're not to scale. And that opens up a question that most archaeologists really don't want to discuss. Walk into any major museum with an ancient Near Eastern collection, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You'll see Assyrian reliefs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Persian friezes. You'll see kings and gods, battles and ceremonies. Standard fare. But there's a category of reliefs that tend to be kept in storage, not because they're damaged or insignificant, because they're inconvenient. Let me show you what I mean. At the Temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt, there's a series of reliefs on the inner walls of the main entrance, that 19-meter doorway I mentioned earlier. The reliefs show a ceremonial scene, Pharaoh Ptolemy XII making an offering to the god Horus. Standard iconography, except for one detail. The proportions are off. In typical Egyptian art, gods are depicted larger than humans to show their importance, symbolic scaling. The king might be shown at 2/3 the height of the god. This is well understood artistic convention. But in these specific reliefs at Edfu, if you measure carefully, the god Horus is shown at a height that, relative to the doorway itself, would make him approximately 12 meters tall, and Pharaoh Ptolemy, shown at about 2/3 of Horus's height, would be roughly 8 meters tall. Now, you could argue this is still symbolic, artistic license, except the doorway is real. It's actually 19 meters tall, and the figures are shown interacting with it, walking through it, at a scale that suggests the doorway was proportioned for them. This pattern repeats. At Karnak, there are reliefs showing processions of priests entering the temple through the massive hypostyle hall entrance. The entrance is about 24 meters high. The priests in the reliefs are shown at a scale that, if translated to real measurements, would make them approximately 5 to 6 meters tall.
Not gods, priests, human-like figures conducting ceremonies, at a scale that's 3 times normal human height. Dr. Hassan, the Egyptologist I mentioned earlier, noted this in her 1988 paper. She didn't make wild claims. She simply observed the proportional relationship between figures and architecture in certain temple reliefs is inconsistent with known Egyptian artistic conventions. The figures are scaled to the architecture, not symbolically enlarged. Scaled to the architecture, as if the artists were depicting the actual users of these spaces. Now, this is where things get historically murky, and I want to be very careful here. There's a category of artifacts, mostly reliefs and carved panels, that were removed from archaeological sites during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was the colonial period. European and American institutions were actively collecting antiquities, not always through legal or ethical means. Many of these artifacts ended up in private collections or in museum storage facilities. Some of them have never been publicly displayed. In 1996, a curator at a museum I won't name because they requested anonymity when I contacted them, told me about a storage facility containing over 400 stone relief panels from various Near Eastern sites. Many were purchased by the museum in the 1860s and 1870s. According to this curator, approximately 40 of these panels depict figures interacting with monumental architecture at unusual proportional scales. Their words. Why aren't they displayed? The official reason, per the museum's internal documentation, is contextual ambiguity and potential for public misinterpretation. Contextual ambiguity. When I asked what that meant specifically, the curator became uncomfortable. They suggested that some artifacts raise questions that are difficult to answer within mainstream archaeological frameworks, and that displaying them without clear explanatory context could fuel pseudo-archaeological speculation, which is, I suppose, a fair concern. But it also means we don't get to see them. We don't get to ask those questions ourselves. And it's not just museums. The Vatican has one of the most extensive collections of ancient artifacts in the world. Their museums display Roman sculptures, Egyptian obelisks, Renaissance paintings. But the Vatican also has archives, deep archives. The Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Secret Archive, contains documents and artifacts dating back over 1,000 years. Access is restricted. Scholars can apply, but the approval process is opaque, and entire sections remain off-limits. In the 1860s and 1870s, that same period when museums were acquiring Near Eastern artifacts, the Vatican purchased numerous items from dealers in Egypt, Lebanon, and Turkey. How many? We don't know exactly. The acquisition records from that period are incomplete. But there are references. In correspondence between Vatican officials and various European dealers, there are mentions of oversized architectural fragments and anomalous figurative reliefs. One letter, dated 1872 from a dealer in Beirut to a Vatican purchaser, describes stone panels depicting giants of unusual proportion recovered from the Baalbek region. The letter is in the Vatican's archives. I found a reference to it in a researcher's notes from 1934. The panels themselves, their current location is unlisted. Now, I need to be clear, I'm not claiming the Vatican is hiding evidence of giants. That's a leap I can't make. What I am saying is this:
There are artifacts from these ancient sites that depict figures at proportions inconsistent with standard human anatomy. Some of those artifacts are in storage, some are in private collections, some may be in institutional archives. We don't have full access to assess them. That's not a conspiracy, it's just how institutions work. They curate. They select what to display based on various criteria: condition, historical significance, exhibit themes, interpretive clarity. But the result is the same. There are pieces of evidence we can't examine. Let me give you a specific example that is publicly accessible, though rarely discussed. At the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, one of the oldest temple complexes in the world, dating to around 9500 BCE, there are massive T-shaped pillars. These pillars are carved with reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. Some of the pillars also have human-like arms carved in relief, positioned as if the pillar itself represents a standing figure. If you interpret the pillar as a stylized body, with the T-shape representing the head and shoulders, the proportions suggest a figure approximately 5.5 meters tall. Now, archaeologists generally interpret these as symbolic representations. The pillar as person is a metaphor, not a literal depiction. But here's the interesting part. The doorways at Göbekli Tepe, the entrances to the circular temple structures, are proportioned to these pillars, as if whoever built the temples built the doorways to accommodate these 5.5-meter figures. Symbolic? Possibly. But the engineering is functional. The spaces work at that scale.
And Göbekli Tepe is old, older than the pyramids by thousands of years. Built by people we assume were hunter-gatherers, just beginning to experiment with agriculture. Yet they created architecturally sophisticated structures with astronomical alignments and proportional systems that suggest advanced planning. Who were they building for? Themselves? At that scale? Or were they replicating something they'd seen? Something older? Because here's where the timeline gets truly strange. In 1967, at the height of the Cold War, the CIA declassified a report about an experiment conducted in Bolivia. An experiment involving these doors. An experiment that ended very suddenly and very quietly. And when you read what happened, you start to understand why some people are nervous about these questions. 1967, the Cold War is at its peak. The United States and Soviet Union are competing on every front: military, scientific, ideological. Both superpowers are also very interested in ancient sites. Why? Because ancient civilizations had technologies we don't fully understand. Stone-cutting techniques, acoustic properties in temples, astronomical precision. If you can reverse engineer ancient technology, maybe you gain an advantage. Sounds far-fetched, but the historical record is clear. Both the CIA and KGB funded archaeological expeditions during this period, often under scientific cover. One of these expeditions went to Tiwanaku, Bolivia. Tiwanaku is a pre-Columbian archaeological site in the Andes. It dates to around 500 CE, though some researchers argue the core structures are older. The site includes massive stone doorways, including the famous Sun Gate, a single piece of andesite stone weighing approximately 10 tons, with a doorway carved through it. The doorway is 3 meters tall, not as massive as Baalbek or Karnak, but still proportionally large for a culture without iron tools or wheeled vehicles. In the summer of 1967, a joint U.S.-Bolivian team arrived at Tiwanaku. Officially, they were conducting a survey for the Bolivian Department of Archaeology. The lead archaeologist was American, affiliated with a university in California. But the funding came from a Department of Defense grant, and 3 of the team members were engineers, not archaeologists. The declassified report, released under FOIA in 2003, is heavily redacted. But the basic outline is clear. The team wasn't there to excavate, they were there to test something. Specifically, they wanted to see if they could open one of the ancient doorways. Now, most of these ancient doors are long gone. The wooden or bronze leaves rotted away or were melted down centuries ago. What remain are the stone frames.
But at Tiwanaku, there was evidence of a door mechanism that might still be functional. The team focused on a secondary entrance to one of the temple compounds. The doorway was carved into a massive stone wall. The frame showed slots and pivot points, consistent with a swinging door mechanism. And inside the frame, there were still metal pins embedded in the stone, bronze or copper, corroded but intact. The team's hypothesis, according to the declassified report, was that these pins were part of a sophisticated pivot system. If they could apply force correctly, maybe the door, or whatever remained of it, would move. They brought hydraulic equipment, military-grade jacks capable of exerting tens of thousands of pounds of force. They positioned the jacks against the stone frame and began applying pressure. For 3 days, nothing happened. On the 4th day, something did. The report describes it clinically. At 1400 hours local time, hydraulic pressure reached approximately 32,000 psi. Acoustic sensors detected vibration within the stone structure. Subsurface movement confirmed. Subsurface movement. Something inside the wall was moving. The team increased pressure. The vibration increased. And then, according to the report, at 1417 hours, mechanism engaged from interior position. Hydraulic pressure dropped precipitously. Team withdrew equipment and sealed site per security protocol. Mechanism engaged from interior position. Read that again. They were pushing from outside. Something responded from inside. The report doesn't elaborate. The next section is entirely redacted. 3 full pages of black bars. The only other detail, project discontinued 1418 hours same day. Personnel evacuated site. Bolivian authorities notified of structural instability concern. 48 hours later, the team was back in the United States. The site was closed to researchers for 6 months, officially due to seismic stability concerns. When it reopened, the doorway in question was blocked with modern concrete, supposedly to prevent collapse. It remains blocked today. I tried to find the team members. 3 are deceased. 1 never published on archaeology again and declined to be interviewed. The lead archaeologist, now in his 80s, responded to my email with a single sentence: "I can't discuss that project." But here's what we can piece together from the unredacted portions of the report. The door mechanism was functional. After 1,000 years, it still worked. It required enormous force to activate, far beyond what human muscle could provide. And when it activated, something happened that made a team of engineers and archaeologists working under Department of Defense funding evacuate within an hour and classify the entire project. What was behind that door? The report doesn't say, but it says enough to make you wonder. If these doors were designed to be opened from the inside, what was inside? Because in 2019, 52 years after that experiment in Bolivia, something happened at another site. Something that was captured on video. Something that was seen by a witness who, to this day, insists what he saw was real. And the video, it was online for exactly 6 hours before it disappeared. I'm going to tell you what was in it, and you can decide what you believe. His name is Sareth Meng. He's a guide at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. In July 2019, he was leading a private tour group through the temple complex just after sunset. This is permitted with special authorization. Angkor Wat officially closes at 5:30 p.m., but certain tour operators can arrange later access for photography. It was during a full moon. Sareth mentioned this detail multiple times when I spoke with him via video call in 2021. The moon was full, and the light was bright enough that the group didn't need flashlights. They were near the western entrance gallery, one of the massive doorways leading into the central temple complex. The doorway is approximately 12 meters high. Sareth said he was explaining the bas-reliefs on the wall when one of the tourists pointed at the doorway and asked, "Is that supposed to open?" He turned around. According to Sareth, the stone doorway, solid stone, no actual door, just an opening carved through the wall, was moving. Not the frame, the opening itself. He described it as like a vertical line of light appearing in the center of the opening, then widening. I asked him to clarify.
He said it looked like the space inside the doorway was splitting, as if there were an invisible door opening inward and the moonlight was catching on its edges. The tourist who'd pointed it out had their phone out. They started recording.
Sareth said the light widened until it formed an opening roughly 2 meters across, running the full height of the doorway. And then, this is where his account becomes difficult to verify, he said something came through. I need to be clear. I'm reporting what Sareth Meng told me. I can't verify it. I wasn't there. But he was consistent across multiple conversations, and he had no apparent motive to fabricate this story. In fact, it cost him professionally. Other guides at Angkor Wat stopped working with him after he started talking about this publicly. He described what he saw as a silhouette. Tall, very tall. He estimated 4 to 5 meters, though he admitted judging height in moonlight is difficult. It stood in the opening for several seconds. Then it stepped through, moved along the wall, and disappeared into the shadows of the gallery. The tourist was still recording. The light in the doorway faded, the opening closed, everything returned to normal. The tourist sent the video to Sareth the next day. Sareth posted it on YouTube and Facebook. He told me the video showed the doorway, the widening line of light, and a dark shape moving across the frame. The video quality was poor, phone camera at night, but you could see something. It was online for approximately 6 hours. Then it was removed, both the YouTube and Facebook versions, simultaneously. YouTube's notifications said removed for violating community guidelines. Facebook's said removed for false information. Neither platform would specify which guideline or what false information. Sareth tried to re-upload. His accounts were suspended for repeated violations. The tourist who took the video? Sareth said they messaged him saying their phone had been remotely wiped. They were angry, accused him of hacking it. They never heard from them again. Now, I know how this sounds. Mysterious video, conveniently disappears, no copies. It's the perfect, unfalsifiable story. And maybe that's all it is, a story. But here's why I'm including it. Sareth isn't the only one. In 2016, a night security guard at Karnak Temple in Egypt reported seeing lights inside the hypostyle hall near one of the major doorways. He reported it to his supervisor. He was reassigned to a different section of the complex the next day. In 2012, a research team working at Göbekli Tepe reported unusual electromagnetic readings near one of the main pillar circles. The readings were strongest during the full moon. The team leader mentioned it in a blog post. The blog was deleted.
In 2008, workers doing restoration at the Temple of Horus in Edfu claimed they heard sounds, mechanical sounds like stone grinding on stone, coming from inside a sealed doorway. The sounds occurred for 3 consecutive nights, then stopped. The workers refused to continue the project unless the doorway was opened and inspected. It was. Nothing was found. Are these all coincidences, misperceptions, hoaxes? Possibly. But they cluster around these sites, these specific doorways, and they tend to occur during full moons. Why the full moon? I don't know. But it's interesting that many ancient cultures timed their major ceremonies to lunar cycles. The Egyptians had monthly temple ceremonies aligned to the new and full moons. The Maya tracked lunar cycles with extraordinary precision. The builders of Stonehenge oriented the structure to lunar standstills. We generally interpret this as religious, symbolic. But what if it was practical? What if something about the lunar cycle affects these structures? We know the moon affects Earth's magnetism. Tidal forces aren't just oceanic, they affect the planet's crust, its magnetic field, even the atmosphere. And I mentioned earlier that these doorways cluster around zones of geomagnetic stability. Is there a connection? I'm speculating now, I recognize that. But when you have ancient structures aligned to lunar cycles, built in geomagnetically stable zones, proportioned for beings of unusual size, and showing evidence of functional mechanisms that still respond to activation attempts, at some point you have to ask, what were these doors for? Really, functionally, actually for? Because if Sareth Meng is telling the truth, if just once, one time, something did come through, then we're asking the wrong question. The question isn't who built these doors. The question is who's still using them. And that question brings us to a theory that most scientists won't touch publicly, but privately in certain circles it's discussed. A theory about what these doors actually are, not monuments, not temples, gateways. Let me introduce you to Dr. Marcus Webb. He's not a household name. In fact, most people have never heard of him. He was a theoretical physicist who worked at CERN in the early 2000s, studying particle physics and high-energy collisions.
In 2011, he resigned. Not retired, resigned. At 43 years old, at the peak of his career. He moved to Mexico and started publishing papers on ancient architecture. The physics establishment essentially disowned him. His papers stopped appearing in major journals. His former colleagues stopped citing his work. But his ideas are compelling. In 2013, he published a paper in an open-access journal, one of the few that would still accept his work, titled Dimensional Apertures and Ancient Megalithic Structures, a Hypothesis. The paper is technical, heavy on mathematics I barely understand, but the core idea is this. Certain configurations of mass and geometry can create localized distortions in spacetime. Under specific conditions, electromagnetic, gravitational, quantum, these distortions could theoretically create what he calls aperture points, doorways, not through space, through dimensions. Now, before you dismiss this as science fiction, consider, we know spacetime can be warped. That's basic relativity. Mass works spacetime. That's why gravity works. We also know quantum mechanics allows for phenomena we can't directly observe in our everyday experience. Superposition, entanglement, things that seem impossible but are mathematically consistent and experimentally verified. Webb's hypothesis, and it's just a hypothesis, is that certain ancient structures might have been designed, intentionally or accidentally, to create stable aperture points. The key requirements, according to his mathematics, massive, precisely arranged stone, specific geometric proportions, alignment to geomagnetic and gravitational vectors, and periodic activation through external energy inputs. Sound familiar? Massive stone, Baalbek, Tiwanaku, Karnak, check. Specific geometric proportions, the 7-to-1 ratio, check. Geomagnetic alignment, the clustering around the 30th parallel, the eastward orientation, check. Periodic activation through external energy inputs, lunar cycles affecting electromagnetic fields, hypothetically, check. Webb's arguments that these structures weren't built by primitive cultures stumbling onto effective designs. They were built by someone or some culture that understood physics at a level we're only now beginning to grasp. And the doorways? They're not symbolic, they're functional. Gateways to somewhere else. Now, I want to be very careful here. Webb's ideas are not accepted by mainstream physics. His mathematics have been criticized by other physicists, those who've bothered to engage with them, as speculative and unfalsifiable, which, to be fair, they are.
You can't test whether an ancient doorway is a dimensional portal without activating it, and we don't know how to do that, or if we should. But here's what's interesting. Webb's hypothesis makes predictions. He predicts that these structures should show unusual electromagnetic properties. They do. Multiple studies have documented electromagnetic anomalies at sites like Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, and Tiwanaku, localized fluctuations that don't match surrounding geology. He predicts that the proportions should correspond to specific gravitational constants, and when you run the numbers, when you calculate the ratios and compare them to known gravitational equations, there are correlations. Not perfect, but suggestive. He predicts that activation events, if they occur, should correlate with celestial mechanics, lunar cycles, solar maximums, planetary alignments. We don't have enough data to test that prediction, but the anecdotal reports, Sarath Meng's account, the Karnak security guard, the Edfu workers, they cluster around full moons. Again, not proof, but consistent. And then there's the question of who built them. If these structures require knowledge of advanced physics, who had that knowledge 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago?
Webb's answer is uncomfortable. Someone from somewhere else. Not necessarily aliens in the popular sense. He doesn't talk about spacecraft or extraterrestrials. He talks about dimensions, parallel realities, universes adjacent to ours where the laws of physics are slightly different, where maybe gravity is stronger, where beings evolved under 40% higher gravitational force, making them denser, stronger, larger, where a 20-meter tall being is normal. And if such beings could create aperture points, gateways between dimensions, they might visit places where gravity is weaker, places like Earth. They might build structures proportioned to their own size. They might leave when they were done, closing the gateways behind them. But the doorways would remain, inactive, waiting, until the conditions align again. This is speculation layered on hypothesis, layered on unproven theory. I recognize that. But let's return to the evidence, the actual physical evidence. Doors too large for humans to operate, proportioned to a 7-to-1 ratio, oriented east, built on geodetic alignments, constructed with precision that challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities, showing electromagnetic anomalies associated with accounts of unusual phenomena. How do we explain all of that? Mainstream archaeology says, impressive but conventional. Large doors for ceremonial purposes. The proportions are aesthetically pleasing. The alignments are astronomical. The precision shows advanced but non-anomalous engineering. The electromagnetic readings are geological. The phenomena are misperceptions or hoaxes.
Each piece can be explained, but altogether? At what point does coincidence become statistically implausible? I spoke with Dr. Webb via email in 2022. He's still in Mexico, still writing, still developing his mathematics. I asked him directly, do you believe these doorways are active portals? His response? I believe they were designed to be. Whether they remain functional after thousands of years is an empirical question. One we're afraid to test. Afraid to test. Because what if we're wrong? What if we open something we can't close? Or what if we're right? What if we activate a doorway and something comes through? Something that's been waiting on the other side. In 2024, just last year, something happened that made me think about this more seriously. Seismographs, across the globe, detected something unusual, and it involved these sites. Because for 7 seconds, on March 14, 2024, at precisely 0317 UTC, every single one of these ancient sites vibrated simultaneously, and nobody can explain why. March 14, 2024, 3:17 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time. Seismographic stations across 6 continents recorded a signal. Not an earthquake. The waveform was wrong. Earthquakes produce P waves and S waves, compression waves and shear waves that travel at different speeds through the Earth's crust. This was different. It was a single frequency vibration, approximately 7 Hz, lasting exactly 7 seconds. And it was localized. The vibration was strongest at specific points: Baalbek, Karnak, Göbekli Tepe, Tiwanaku, Angkor Wat, Hattusa, and approximately 40 other ancient sites. Sites with monumental doorways. The initial reports were scattered. A seismologist in Chile noticed the Tiwanaku reading and assumed it was instrument error. A geologist in Egypt saw the Karnak spike and thought it was construction work. But then a graduate student at Berkeley, someone monitoring global seismic data for a research project, noticed the pattern. All the readings occurred at the same time, exactly the same time, accounting for the speed of seismic wave propagation. That means they originated simultaneously, not from a single point spreading outward, but from multiple points activating at once. How is that possible? The student published a preliminary report on a university server. It was picked up by a few geology blogs. Then it disappeared. Not deleted. The server went down for maintenance. When it came back up, the report was gone.
The student, I won't name them because they asked me not to, told me they were advised by their department chair to drop the research. Not a productive avenue for your dissertation, they were told. They showed me their data before it was scrubbed. I have screenshots. The signal is real. 7 Hz for 7 seconds. Why is that significant? 7 Hz is within the range of the Earth's natural resonance frequency, the Schumann resonances, named after physicist Winfried Otto Schumann, who predicted them in 1952. These are electromagnetic resonances in the cavity between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. The fundamental frequency is about 7.83 Hz, close to 7. But Schumann resonances are electromagnetic, not seismic. They don't produce ground vibrations. Yet something produced a 7 Hz seismic signal simultaneously at ancient sites around the world. I reached out to Dr. Webb, asked if his portal hypothesis could account for this. His response was cautious. He said that if aperture points were theoretically possible, and if these sites were designed to create them, a synchronized activation signal would require some kind of triggering mechanism, something that could affect multiple distant points simultaneously. What could do that? A cosmic event? A solar flare? A gravitational wave from a distant astronomical source? We don't know. There were no significant solar events on March 14th, no detected gravitational waves, no unusual cosmic ray activity. But there was one thing. March 14th, 2024 was 2 days after a new moon, and the Earth was at a point in its orbit where gravitational forces from the Sun and Moon were in near-perfect alignment. Not a total alignment, that would be an eclipse, but close. Tidal forces were slightly elevated, geomagnetic activity was slightly increased. Nothing extraordinary, but maybe enough? If these structures are sensitive to electromagnetic and gravitational conditions, if Webb's hypothesis has any validity, maybe the signal was a response.
Not something we did, something they did. The structures, or whatever built them. Testing, checking, seeing if the gateways are still functional, knocking on the door. Now, let me bring this back to reality. There are scientists working on explaining the March signal. Geologists, seismologists, physicists. They're looking at tectonic activity, underground water flows, industrial resonances. They'll probably find a conventional explanation, a series of coincidences that, together, created this pattern. Because that's how science works. You look for the simplest explanation that fits the data, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What I've presented here isn't extraordinary evidence. It's suggestive data, anomalies, patterns that might mean something or might mean nothing. But here's what we can say with certainty. Ancient cultures built monumental doorways that are proportioned for beings much larger than humans. These doorways share specific mathematical ratios across continents and millennia. They're aligned to geodetic and astronomical patterns that suggest sophisticated knowledge. They're associated with electromagnetic anomalies and occasional unusual phenomena. And in 2024, they all vibrated simultaneously for 7 seconds. Those are facts. What they mean is interpretation. Maybe they're ceremonial monuments built large to inspire awe. Maybe independent cultures converged on similar proportions because those proportions are aesthetically powerful. Maybe the alignments reflect common astronomical observations. Maybe the electromagnetic readings are geological quirks. Maybe the March signal was a natural resonance phenomenon we don't yet understand. All of that is possible. Or maybe, as Dr. Webb suggests, these structures are technology, ancient, sophisticated, and still functional. Maybe they were built by someone who understood dimensions and space-time in ways we're only beginning to explore. Maybe the doors are waiting. Maybe on March 14th, for 7 seconds, someone checked to see if anyone was home. And maybe eventually they'll knock again, longer this time, louder, until someone answers. So where does that leave us? With questions. More questions than answers. Were these doors built for giants?
For gods? For beings from another dimension? Or are they simply the ambitious creations of human cultures who wanted to build something grand, something lasting, something that connected Earth to the heavens in a symbolic sense? There's no scientific consensus. There's no definitive proof pointing in any single direction. What we have is a mystery, one that spans continents, millennia, and perhaps even dimensions. And mysteries like this don't get solved by choosing sides. They get solved by staying curious, by looking at the evidence from every angle, by entertaining possibilities without immediately dismissing them or blindly accepting them. So I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to ask you what you think. Look at the doors. Look at the proportions. Look at the patterns. And ask yourself, if you were standing in front of that 24-meter doorway in Baalbek, looking up at stone slots carved 15 meters off the ground, would you think symbolic monument? Or would you think someone used this, someone reached those mechanisms, someone walked through that door? And then ask the harder question, are they still out there, on the other side, waiting for the conditions to align, waiting for us to finally understand what we're looking at? Because if the March signal was a knock, what happens when the door opens? If this got you thinking, if you want to explore more mysteries that challenge our understanding of history and reality, subscribe to this channel. We're just getting started. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Are these doors ceremonial monuments? Ancient technology? Something else entirely? Because here's the truth. I don't have the answers. Nobody does. But maybe by asking the questions together, by examining the evidence without prejudice, we'll get closer to understanding. Or maybe we'll discover that some doors are meant to stay closed. Either way, I want to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and keep looking up. Or, in this case, keep looking at the doors.